So this session this morning is, as you know, around the inequalities that COVID has generated. Although, as I think we may all well be aware, it isn't necessarily COVID that's generated it. It's the responses and failures to mitigate it. I'm going to kick off just by saying a little bit by way of explaining how things are going to run in this session, and then I'll say a little bit myself and then hand over to a very excellent panel of speakers we have lined up for you. So my name is, probably gathered, is Sally Witcher. I am the founder, director of Social Enterprise Inclusive New Normal, which is aimed at driving forward the learning arising through the pandemic towards a safe and inclusive new normal. I've worked on inequality and exclusion throughout my entire career in various roles. And I think, I'm also a disabled person and wheelchair user and have been most of my life. And what really struck me about when COVID arrived was the kinds of inequality I was experiencing were not the same as they were when I was, and still are, as a wheelchair user. What used to stop me going to places before were physical barriers, not being able to get into buildings or transport. And what stops me now, as somebody who's also clinically high risk, and what has kept me largely imprisoned in my home for 4.5 years, with no prospect of early release for good behaviour, is the risk to my life. So the aims of this session are to consider how existing inequalities have been made worse and how new types of inequality have been created, in some cases for new groups of people. Obviously, this is a vast topic and we cannot hope to cover everything, but we'll do what we can by focusing as tightly as we can on specific inequalities around COVID and responses to it. And we do want to discuss what can be done to reduce that inequality and the rights we therefore need. Our experiences in some ways are going to be the same, even if our situations are different. So many of us have experienced gaslighting, for example, and clinical risk is something that cuts across people who've not had COVID but would be seriously impacted, as well as those that have had it and have got long COVID. So we need to think about where we share experiences and needs and where they differ. In terms of how we run this, we'll have speakers first. Each is going to speak for 5 minutes. And I will let each speaker know when they're coming towards the end of that time, if that helps. We're not having breakout rooms for this session. We're all going to stay together. The chat will be deactivated while people are speaking, as it can be distracting. Whilst people are speaking, though, you can put comments only in the Google Doc, the link for which is in the chat. When presentations are over, the chat will be enabled, but please also use the raised hand icon. And you can find that at the bottom of your screen where it says react. Can you see that? If anybody everybody understand where that is? Just a bit concerned that people don't know where to use it. If you can't use it though, for whatever reason, please put your question in the chat. So I've just lost my screen and all my notes. Excellent. So can I ask everybody to keep the microphones off when they're not speaking? It isn't only distracting for everyone, it's also an access issue. So there'll be time for questions afterwards. We're never going to get through all the questions, I suspect. So I will allow people, enable the chat for a bit longer if people have questions that they didn't get a chance to ask, but we'd like to have those recorded. So does that all sound okay? Has anyone got any questions before we even begin? No, Joan's going to assist me to keep tabs on all that's coming in, because my ability to multitask is somewhat limited. Okay, so I'm going to kick off with just a few remarks of my own. if that's okay with everyone. So I've obviously puzzled a lot about what these differences are around the kinds of inequality that I certainly was experiencing and the kind I now am. And it seems to me that central to this new kind of inequality is it's around risk and it's around failures to mitigate it. And there are essentially two sorts of risk. There's clinical risk because of people's clinical status, and there's also exposure risk. Because what we know is that the more often people get reinfected, the greater or the more likely they are to have long-term health damage and in turn clinical risk. And these require different kinds of action to mitigate them. So for clinical risk, it's obviously things like vaccines, things like Evusheld and antivirals. It's about building the person's clinical resilience or minimizing clinical damage. For exposure risk, it's about clean air, it's about respiratory masks, it's about action to remove risk in the environment or prevent that risk in the environment from entering our and other people's bodies. So these are distinct risks, but they're also interconnected and intersect. Because if exposure risk is mitigated, then clinical risk becomes much less relevant. If exposure risk isn't mitigated, though, it isn't just people at clinical risk who have a problem, it's those that actually don't, but who might end up with it through cumulative damage. So this is why health and social care workers and teachers, people in high exposure risk environments, top the long COVID league table of professions. You then need to think about how these types of risks kind of overlay protected characteristic groups. So health conditions are more likely to be associated with older and disabled people. And maybe high exposure risk workforces are disproportionately comprised of women or BAME people, for example. So where this ends up is that clinical risk is a risk for all, but particularly those who already have it, either previously or those that acquire it because of repeated infection. And this is why clean air is also relevant to all. But the key point here, I think, is we now have the tools to mitigate all of that. They're not being used. And it's no longer, therefore, COVID that's driving inequality. It's the response to it. And what has been that response? Well, when COVID arrived, people talked about we're all in the same storm, but we're in different boats. For some, lockdown meant they couldn't go for their favourite walk in the hills. For others, it meant being unable to get out of bed for 2 days or longer, having care packages withdrawn overnight, having no access to food or medication. The Great Barrington Declaration, which people here may well have heard of, a lot started with that. It went wrong very early on. That actively advocated the segregation of people at high clinical risk from the rest of society, whilst everybody else went around acquiring fictitious herd immunity. How often did we hear on the radio by experts telling us only the old and people who have health conditions need to be concerned? Only. Well, that's us. That's me. But we were seen, as we learned in the COVID inquiry, as nothing more than an impediment to the economy. It was our bodies that they were content to pile high. The fact that some of us may have been, and indeed were, employers ourselves, higher rate taxpayers, we were the workforce, somehow seems to escape them. The removal of protections, as we have seen, what that has meant is the progressive loss of our rights to equal citizenship. Suddenly, well, for example, the removal of mask requirements, people were being told to remember the vulnerable. We were left dependent on people's memory and their goodwill to protect us. Well, newsflash, guess what? They didn't. We've seen the removal of health and safety in the workplace, the removal of the evidence base, data wound down, people, omission of key information, and so much gaslighting, the minimizing, the disinformation, which actually, let's call it what it is. Disinformation is lying. It's not, it's just a cold. Vaccine has neutralized risk for all, but those who can't respond to vaccine. No, well, no, it hasn't. Um, and so on. And what they've ended up doing is making health and care settings, of all settings, probably the most risky. And these are the settings where older and clinically high-risk people are very likely to be. It goes further with bullying of sick people into work or school, making protection more difficult and unaffordable. And right now, there's a concerted effort to focus on mitigations as the primary risk, rather than actually the things that they were mitigating. We've seen also, really worryingly, the beginnings of enforced removal of protections, mask bans starting to come in the States, and hints of it coming over here as well. And just like yesterday, I think, there's attendance pledge. Children pledging or being told to come in and pledging to come into school when they're unwell. How did child protection come to equal driving infection? This isn't just a failure to protect people from infection. It amounts to a strategy to drive infection. Whether or not deliberate, the impact, and it's hard to put it otherwise, looks like eugenics. Yet it could be so very different. There has been such an extraordinary amount of learning, both medical and environmental, that could be driving new equality and opportunities for inclusion. The widespread use of online has opened up opportunities for people formerly excluded, for example. And this learning has brought potentially wider benefits, for example, in addressing climate